our sermon series that we've been in for all of Lent, where we have taken this book that's called What Every Christian Needs to Know About the Jewishness of Jesus, and we are using that understanding that Jesus lived his entire life as a Jew. What does that have in store for us when we interpret the words that Jesus said, the things that Jesus did, and his time on earth? So today we're talking about surviving a wilderness of temptation. I love the time in Lent where we talk about the wilderness because that experience is so rich and it just resonates so much with our own lives. Anybody, can you honestly say that you have never lived through a time of wilderness, a time of testing, a time of difficulty, a time where you wondered if you would ever feel nourished again? Anybody? No, we've all lived through that, so that's our shared experience. Sometimes it can feel that way in like the life of work or the life of family or even in the life of the church, right? And so there have been a lot of stuff going on in our church. Like we shifted the worship times. Anybody trying to figure out which service still fits your schedule best, right? And we've shifted kind of our overall focus as a body of Christ and like ways that we can reach out into our community. And so I got a phone call this week that sort of rocked my world and really reached into any sense of wilderness. It was a phone call that, you look at the caller ID on your phone and you see this person and you kind of go, oh my goodness. And when just to give you an idea, I'll tell you who it is in just a second. Just to give you an idea of how big this was, I told Paul about it right after I got off the phone with this person, and I just had this excitement in my voice. I was like, you'll never guess who called. And he says, the president? And I said, close. Almost. It was the bishop of our whole conference. So if you're wondering, like, okay, what is the dynamic here? I think it might be comparable, actually. If I was a public official and I'd been elected to an office, it might be kind of the same as if the president called me, right? So that's how I was feeling when my caller ID said Bishop Bob Hoshibata. I went, oh my goodness. I've only received one other phone call from the bishop in my whole life. And of course, that's why it's now programmed into my phone so that he can't take me off guard again. He called and I said, good morning, Bishop. How are you? And he said, you know what, I am just calling. He just said, hi, I'm calling to check in with how you are. And I said, is there anything that prompted this call? Is there another agenda here? And he said, no, actually, I have been hearing all these things about Song of Life. And I've been hearing the wonderful work and focus. And I've been watching from afar the things that your church is doing. And he said, I just want to tell your church, good job. Whoa, that's amazing. I said, I will pass that on. And Bishop, thank you very much. So the bishop sends his greetings and says, good job, church. Well done. So keep on doing what you're doing. So now I'm going to tell you a story that I hope does not get back to the bishop about a time in which I felt like I was wandering. I actually was wandering the wilderness, lost, and feeling quite a bit afraid. This goes back to my youth ministry days before I got ordained, and I was serving Catalina United Methodist Church in Tucson. And we had this event that we did every year, the Good Friday hike. And we'd go out. The kids were off from school that day, so we'd take a hike. This probably isn't a good thing to tell you because we're going to redo it this year here. This Good Friday, we're going to have a Good Friday hike. I promise it won't be like this. But it was like the third year I'd been serving at that church, and I was like the assistant youth pastor. And so the head youth pastor came to me and he said, I'd like for you to head up the Good Friday hike this year. And I just thought, all right, like he believes in me. He sees that I can do this, So I set about trying to plan the Good Friday hike. And so I picked the spot that I was most familiar with. There's Tucson Mountain Park. It was really close to my house. I go hiking there all the time by myself, and I take the dog, and so I felt like I knew it, right? I said, that's where we're going to go. We're going to take this trail that's kind of a loop, and so you go down the regular trail, and then there's a point where you can branch off, and it takes you over to the other side of the trail. It's like a shortcut. So that would make the hike only about 3 miles. this is pretty good because we'll have like 6th graders through 12th graders. So I did the hike a couple of times by myself in the month before we were going to do the Good Friday hike. And then, things get really busy during Holy Week at a church. I'm just saying. So I did not hike that hike during that week before. And it rained. Yeah, it rained. We don't get a whole lot of water in the desert, but what happens when it does rain in the desert? What happens? It blooms. The desert blooms. It grows, right? So yeah. So the desert bloomed and grew a little bit, but I still thought we were okay. So we head out on the hike, and we planned it so that we would arrive back at the parking lot just at sunset. And so we set out on the hike. We don't need to bring flashlights. We don't need to bring jackets. It's perfectly warm out and the sun is out. So we set off down the road, and everything's going great, and the kids are having such a great time, chatting along the way. And we kept on going a little bit longer than I thought we probably should, but I kept looking for that turnoff. I kept looking for that point where you turn and then you catch the trail back, right? And it's only a 3-mile loop. Well, if you keep going, it's like a 10-mile loop. Yeah. So we kept going, and I was still real quiet, but in my head I'm thinking, I cannot find that turnoff. I can't find that turnoff. And pretty soon people start talking. They're like, should we turn around now? Should we turn? No, it'll be okay. We're going to find it. Well, we didn't find it. So eventually I had to say, you guys, I'm sorry, but we got to turn back, and I'm really sorry that I messed this up and that I waited so long to have us turn back. And so we turned tail, and we tried to head back as fast as we could, but the sun set. And at the end of the hike, we ended up back in the parking lot when it was dark, and the last stretch of the hike was me and the other leaders towing some of those 6th grade kids, saying it's going to be all right. Yes, we're almost there. I know you're cold. I know you're hungry. You're starving. I heard you. Yes. Things don't always pan out when we're in the wilderness, right? Things don't always go as planned, and we end up in situations where we get fearful, and we feel like we've done wrong. We may even have shame. We have a lot of doubt. So we're going to talk about the story of Jesus in the wilderness, and I love the passage in the wilderness because it shapes the sermon into 3 easy points, okay? Jesus is tempted 3 times in 3 different ways in the desert. The first one I call the temptation of empty calories, which by empty calories, I mean false nourishment, right? But we can relate to the idea of empty calories because tell me, what happens when you get really, really, really hungry? What sort of food do you reach for? Junk, that's right. Whatever's closest, whatever's fastest, whatever's easiest, stuff like this, right? Okay, so there's this Christian comedian who has a great take on the way that we pray over food, and so we're going to hear from him for just a second.
I love this one over food. Sometimes we pray over food and ask God to make up for our bad choices when we eat. That's funny. No matter what it is, Lord, bless this food to the nourishment of our bodies. Lord, bless this bag of Cheetos. And this jumbo Dr. Pepper, Lord. Somehow make this nourish us in some way. I don't know how you're going to do it, Father, but we just trust in you now. Father, change the molecular structure of this food. This complete trash we're about to shove in our gullet. Change the Cheeto into a carrot stick on the way down. Spirit of low carb, rain down on me now. I pray a hedge of protection around my pancreas, Lord. Right now. Intervene!
Oh, man, if you want more of that, his name is Tim Hawkins. You can look him up online. But he goes on, and I think that it's so funny because we get it. We relate to it. Sometimes we go and we yearn after, we seek after things that are full of empty calories, whether it's food for our body or food for our souls. We go after things that seem easier, that seem more comfortable, instead of going after true nourishment that will really fill our souls. So Jesus is fasting when he's in the wilderness, and he's fasting for 40 days. So there's two concepts about that idea of fasting that we can take away from it. The first one is the idea of fasting as sacrifice. So in Judaism, and especially in the time that Jesus was living, the idea of fasting in your body was equal to the importance of sacrificing an animal on the altar, right? Because if you're sacrificing an animal, you're actually killing something that will bring your life nourishment. You are sacrificing something that's very, very important to your livelihood. And in the same way, when you're fasting from food in your body, you are sacrificing something that's very, very important for your livelihood. The second way we can think about fasting is that it serves to bring a person into a different state of mind. You know, nowadays we might just call that lightheadedness, right? But we're talking about kind of a lightness in our soul too. When you go without eating for a certain period of time, isn't there just kind of there's like a lightness in your belly? Right? There's a lightness also in your soul. So the idea of sacrificing food is also the idea of sacrificing other things of spiritual weight that weigh us down. And what about this idea of 40 days? The idea of 40 days seems kind of overwhelming, right? The idea of going without food for 40 days, that's a little scary. In Judaism, they think of this, especially now, as a process, the idea of 40 days. It's a time of testing. It's not necessarily the number or literally going without food for 40 days. But if you can be in a certain state for 40 days, it's like you've been put to the test. And it's like your goal or the reality of what you've been trying to accomplish becomes bigger, becomes more real. So think about, Moses fasts for 40 days and 40 nights when he's on top of Mount Sinai. Or during Noah's time, the flood in Genesis lasts for 40 days and 40 nights. Or go back to Moses again. When he flees from Egypt, he spends 40 days in Midian. The idea of 40 is a time of testing. We do this today too. Think about the modern equivalent. When you start a new job, you have like a probationary period, right? So it's you getting used to the job, it's them getting used to you, and there's a time of evaluation usually at the end of that probationary period. Or think about the military. When someone goes into the military, it's like 7 weeks of boot camp, is that right? There's a time of testing, a time of vetting, a time of making some goal a little bit more real. The idea that we seek after real nourishment. I really love this quote from a situation in a movie, The American President. And in The American President, the president, who's the current president, and he's running for re-election, he doesn't want to get into all that election junk, He doesn't want to engage with the nastiness that happens in every election year. We can relate with this right now. Eventually, he finds that he has to, because his voice is missing from the arena. And one of his advisors, one of his counselors, is in his office one day, and he's getting very angry with the president. He says to him, in the absence of genuine leadership, they'll listen to anyone who steps up to the microphone. They want leadership. They're so thirsty for it, they'll crawl through the desert toward a mirage, and when they discover there's no water, they'll drink the sand. But the president answers, people don't drink the sand because they're thirsty. They drink the sand because they don't know the difference. The second temptation that Jesus faces in the desert is the temptation of the Lone Ranger. The idea that we can do it all ourselves, right? So actually, when I was looking for the picture of the Lone Ranger, it was hard to find one of just him by himself because he's always there with his sidekick, right? There are very few pictures of him by himself because even in the show, he's not by himself all that often. So let's take a little bit more recent example. Anybody know who Bear Grylls is? This guy? He's a reality TV star, but he stars on a show called Man vs. Wild. And so literally the whole premise of the show is they take him and they drop him into some sort of wilderness, the jungle, the desert, I don't know. Somebody said to me earlier that probably the hardest place to survive would be the middle of the ocean. Anybody know, has he done that one? Have you seen the show? I don't know if he's done that one, but that would be really interesting. So the whole idea, though, is they just drop him in by himself. He takes his own little, sort of selfie camera. And so it's all made up to think that he is doing all of this completely on his own. I mean, sometimes they allow him some provisions, but a lot of times they don't. So he just has to figure it out. But in reality, do you really think that's what happens? Right. Sometimes there's a cameraman with him, right? He's not doing the selfie thing. That's right. Yeah. Plus, what TV studio, what network would take on that kind of liability, right? Okay, so let me introduce you to Megan Hine. This is Megan. Megan has survived killer snakes. She's survived not washing for 3 months. She has even survived a situation where she had to run away from gun-toting opium farmers. And she manages to keep dozens of clueless celebrities alive for outdoor endurance reality shows. So Megan goes out there and she does it first. They drop her into the wilderness. She figures out the tricks. She tells Bear Grylls how to do it. I know, I just ruined the show for you. Sorry. Spoiler alert. We have this same idea where we think of Bear as going out there and doing it all himself, that he does everything alone. We kind of take that same approach when we see Jesus going into the wilderness. We think, all right, he went into the wilderness alone to be tested. But actually, that's not true. There's this one line that gets overlooked in the scripture. It says he was with the wild animals and angels attended him. Even Jesus does not go the Lone Ranger route. And when we try to do it ourselves, when we rely on, well, I'm the only one who can take care of this, right? We only leave room for reliance on ourselves. There is no room for us to call upon God when we are in need, when we are struggling. Okay, the third temptation that Jesus faces is the temptation of being right. So it's kind of related to the second temptation too. So here's the perfect quote for it. I'm right, you're wrong, I win, you lose, right? This is a temptation to set up walls between one another, to make it our validation, to bring righteousness to our side of the wall. I want to talk to you about the concept of mercy when we're talking about this third temptation. So we brought up the concept of mercy when we were talking in our small group, the interruption small group that I lead in between the morning services, and then we do it again at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And we're talking about, what does mercy actually mean? Well, somebody just Googled it really fast and came up with this great definition of what mercy is. Mercy is compassion or forgiveness shown towards someone whom it is within one's power to punish or harm. So mercy is when we're completely capable of coming down hard on somebody and capable of saying we're right and you're wrong, but we don't. Or when when we deserve to be told that we're wrong and God is right, but God doesn't say that either. Not like that, right? There's an idea in the giving of the 10 Commandments that the book, this Jewishness of Jesus, talks about. This story I'm going to tell you is not in Torah. It's not in the Bible. This is an additional interpretation that was brought about over time by people that Judaism would refer to as sages. What is the difference between a sage and a prophet? It's where they discover God working in our lives. So a prophet studies sort of future and points out opportunities for righteousness and goodness, but a sage looks into the past and shows us how we made way for God's healing presence and loving power through the choices that we've made and the paths that we've followed. So a sage strengthens us with the gift of meaning. So the story that the sages tell about the 10 Commandments is that actually, what if God had actually called lots of different groups of people out into the wilderness, not just the Israelites? And that all these different groups of people were presented with the law. God said, here is the law, will you abide by it? And they all said, what is it? We don't know what's in it, we need to know first. And so God explained what the law was. And every group said, no, we cannot abide by that. Until God came to the Israelites. And God presented the law to the Israelites, and they said, yes, we will abide by your law, God. Now, there's a little bit of a hiccup because while Moses was on Mount Sinai, they, created the golden calf and, they strayed from God's ways. But when the Ten Commandments came down off the mountain and Moses stood before them with his face shining so brightly, they realized how desperately they were in need and knew that they could not hold that wall between them and God. It could not be, nope, we are right. We can be a Lone Ranger and we can be right, and that can be wrong. They had to break down the wall. They recognized the need, and that makes it so much more powerful when they teach it or they live it. So this month is Black History Month, right? February is Black History Month. Next month is Women's History Month. And it gets me to thinking, there's all these pictures around social media, and it talks about, all the stories that have come before, some of them in living memory and some of them long before that. The stories of people who have done tremendous things and who have been so incredibly brave in following the ways of God and putting them into practice in our world, in our country. Last night I found myself looking at a picture of women who were marching along a street, clearly in the early 1900s. And they're fully dressed, covered from ankle to neck to end of sleeve. And they're carrying signs that say, women, the right of women to vote. It was just yesterday in 1922 that the U.S. Supreme Court voted unanimously that women could vote. And I look at that picture and I just have this overwhelming realization of the number of people and the debt that I owe to those who have come before me, because it's the path that they cleared through the wilderness that I now walk. What path are you walking that someone has cleared ahead of you? And then the question, of course, is what path are we clearing right now? And through what wilderness are we trotting for those who walk alongside us and who come behind us? We continue our worship of God through the giving of our tithes and our offerings.